Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the Embrace Mental Health podcast,
where we embrace a not-so-clinical approach
to conversations surrounding all things mental health. Happy Mental Health Monday, everybody, and welcome to the Embrace Mental Health podcast. Today we are in episode 20, so we are officially in the 20s now, which is, I remember when I thought like 5 was a big deal, or when 10 was a big deal, so we're just cruising right along now. But yes, today's episode is kind of the next installment, so to speak, of the dealing with feelings concept, and so we had kind of covered the basis of what that looks like. But then today, specifically, we are looking more towards what does this look like for people who might have a little bit of a harder time getting in touch with their emotions. So for our big feelers out there, there will be an episode for you coming up soon. But for today, we're kind of gearing it more towards those people who are maybe a little less familiar with what being in touch with your emotions looks like or feels like. But of course, we always have our introductory question first. So Wesley came up with this one, and I thought this was interesting, but this question is, what for you is your most nostalgic year? And I think Wes and I are both highly nostalgic people. So I was like, this seems
definitely
like a good question for us. Yeah.
We like to enjoy our memories. That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. Wes, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. For me, I've identified it as 2002. And so to give y'all an idea of exactly how old I am, I was 11 years old. I turned 11 in 2002.
Everyone do the math right now.
Yeah. And yeah, whenever I come across something from that year, I'm just like, yeah, that was, I mean, it's certainly, I don't believe in like, I peaked in middle school or high school, certainly not middle school. Oh my gosh. But, I'm totally not somebody who sees my life that way, but I do have a special emotional connection. I think it's because I was going through a lot of change during that year. Obviously, 11 is prime puberty beginning time, but also just even externally in my life, we were moving, we were kind of changing communities. And also I was really close with some of my best friends during that time. So like Spider-Man and GameCube games and like, I don't know, certain songs that come on. It's like, I wouldn't say it's the best year culturally, but it does cut me deep when I come across things from there.
That's fair. Yep. Mine is a little bit of I don't want to say cheating, but it seems like a little bit of an obvious answer in some ways. But mine is 2008. So again, you'll be able to do the math for me a little bit too. But 2008 was both the year that I graduated from high school and started my freshman year of college. And so I think it's just like that time where you kind of you get a little bit of both of very nostalgic times for me. Like for me, middle school was a miserable time. So like, well, I definitely, if I see some stuff from that era, I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember Beanie Babies and like some of those 90s trends. But but I don't have as fond of memories of that time of my life. Whereas high school, I really did enjoy a lot about high school. And then I really did enjoy a lot about college. And so that year is kind of like that year where I got the end of high school, which was fun, and then the start of college, which was fun, and like definitely love all kinds of music from that era. Was definitely I didn't realize, actually this is ironic, I didn't plan this, but I'm wearing my Dashboard Confessional sweatshirt right now.
Oh, there you
so
go.
I was definitely big into the emo music at that point, and then I mean just like all the popular songs that were on at that point too, of remembering all the end of the era school dances and music and that kind of stuff. And then just having that time where I had my high school friends, but also still was meeting my college friends at that point too, and just enjoyed that point of my life. And so all those things from that era is always very deeply nostalgic for me. So
Very exciting time. I would say, I'm a year younger than you, so '09, like right around there was just, it's a close contender for
Hmm.
for nostalgic times. So
Yep.
yeah, kind
Yep.
of fun to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
All
All
right.
right. So we will dive into our topic now. So as we had said, this is kind of along those same lines as same general topic as our dealing with feelings episode, but this is for just kind of looking at it for more of we had talked about how there are generally people tend to either struggle with identifying or understanding emotion as much, or you have people who are a little bit more likely to be controlled by their emotions. And obviously we want to have a little bit more balance in there. But so today we are looking more specifically, we had shared 5 steps towards dealing with your feelings. And so today we're going to kind of look into 3 specific of those steps that we think might be helpful to dive into a little bit deeper for those who might have a little bit of a harder time understanding their emotions. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess just to give kind of a preview, the 3 big steps that we're going to be going over are to identify your feelings, accept your feelings, and expressing your feelings. So uh, yeah, I'm excited to talk about this topic because I do tend to be more on the analytical side of things. Like, I would say that I am pretty in touch with my emotions. I cry easily, especially for, a man in his 30s. Uh, I wear my heart on my sleeve, relatively speaking. Like, I'm not afraid of those things and never really have been, but that's not my default in most situations. Most of the time, it's like, uh, yeah, rational thought and just approaching things logically, not being ruled by my emotions. That's kind of where I tend to default to. So I'm excited to talk about this stuff. Um, so when it comes to identifying feelings, first of all, I really wanted to, I think it's probably because I just watched this movie a couple weeks ago, but rewatched it. But I really wanted to give a shout out to the Pixar Disney film Inside Out. For anybody who hasn't seen that, if you are somebody who listens to a mental health podcast, you need to watch Inside Out. It's fantastic, like so many of the great Pixar movies. And I would say it's probably in the top 5 for me overall as a Pixar film. But
Mhm.
uh, it's funny. It's for all ages. Everybody can relate to something in there. But the part that really impressed me, especially on this last rewatch, was just how accurately they portray emotions and how emotions work in the brain, how they interact with one another, how they come out. I can't believe the geniuses behind that film that they could tell this compelling, entertaining story and get everything basically right when it comes to the neuroscience and the mental health side of things. So definitely check that out to get like a good, easily digestible idea of these feelings. And I think that there are like 5 feelings in everybody's brain in that. I've heard that Inside Out 2 is coming out soon and they're adding another emotion. So I'm interested to see how that goes. But I really like in that how the emotions interact with one another and how as a child becomes a teenager, the emotions kind of combine into more complex emotions. And I also really like how uh, the joy, the kind of joy and happiness is sort of the leading emotion in the main character's brain. And she tries to kind of seclude sadness off to the side, which a lot of us can relate to. And I guess here's a spoiler, but not a major one. But the sadness emotion ends up becoming one of the most important characters in the story, and it talks about how no, we actually need sadness, or in some cases, anger or disgust. These all serve very important purposes in our lives. Sometimes that's what we need the most, even though it's unpleasant.
We had talked some in our initial episode about this, about how one of the useful tools for this can be a feelings wheel, and how helpful that can be, because sometimes when you have this emotion but you just can't put words to it, there is a certain power of being able to put a word to it. And the Inside Out movie kind of covers the bottom of that wheel, but then as you look deeper into it, like obviously I am angry is helpful to understand, but then there's a difference between I am angry because of an injustice, or I'm angry because I made a mistake, or I'm angry, there's a lot of different ways that anger can be caused or expressed. And so the farther you can go down that wheel too, to kind of have a more specific word that can be helpful in the identifying journey too. A few weeks ago was having some strong emotions and went up and looked up the graphic that Autumn posted for this, and it's like, okay, I'm going to look up a feelings wheel, and I really did find it to be helpful to be like, okay, like these are specific specific emotions and specific words for what I'm experiencing right now, which can help. Just the power of words for understanding is helpful. So
Absolutely. Hearing you bring up about anger, Kelsey, and I think this goes along well with this concept of identifying emotions, is that sometimes we have emotions that we are more comfortable with than others. And anger is probably the prime example of that as a masking emotion. A lot of us, and traditionally it's men, but it definitely is regardless of your gender, anger could be the one that you were told or that was demonstrated to you to be really the acceptable emotion for you, especially growing up as a child. Or for some, it's happiness. Again, referencing back to Inside Out, it's like whatever you do, don't be sad, because then that'll make the people around you upset or sad. So whatever it is, it's good to ask yourself, like, what is the emotion or the couple of emotions that I do feel actually the most comfortable expressing? Because sometimes using anger again as the easy example, it comes out as anger. And on the surface, it feels like anger. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you find that under that is an emotion that perhaps would make you feel more vulnerable to express directly. So for those of us where anger is the first kind of emotion on the shelf that we reach for, and underneath that might be something like sadness or fear or guilt or loneliness, betrayal, these kinds of things that even as I say these words, perhaps some of you are like, ooh, like that, or pain is a big one. I would say more than half the time, that's kind of the usual suspect for me when it comes to anger. Is it's like, in what way is this person hurting? And they feel like they need to lash out and protect themselves.
mm-hmm.
So good to ask yourself, okay, what's the emotion that I'm feeling on the surface? But might that be just the most comfortable feeling for me to feel and express, and what else might be under there? Thinking of, I've heard it described, anger in particular, as an iceberg, right? Where the 10% is above the water. And it's like, okay, maybe 10% of the time, it's just straight up anger. You are pissed off about something, and anger can tell us that something needs to change. And that's really valuable to be aware of. But then the other 90% of the time, it's the stuff that we don't see under the surface that expresses as anger on the top. Another thing I wanted to talk about is, as we're talking about feelings, what came to mind is maybe the most basic concept in cognitive behavioral therapy. And that is that feelings come to us without, at least in the moment, we can't control how we feel about something. We encounter something, some kind of an event or something we witness, and it triggers a feeling. And that's very simple. And then a feeling leads to a thought, and a thought leads to a behavior. And a lot of people out there believe also that we can't control our thoughts. And we can't control every single thought that enters our mind, of course. But um, I think that we can assert some control in our thoughts by being aware of our thoughts, choosing which ones we focus on. We can counter our thoughts. If something, again, in the CBT frame of language here, if an irrational thought enters our mind or a destructive thought enters our mind, we can notice that, and then we can counter it with something that is more rational or more constructive or more neutral. And we can do it in a way that feels true. We're not trying to sort of trick ourselves, but it's like, okay, that's one way of seeing it, but here's another accurate way of seeing it that's going to work out a lot better for me if I focus on this. And then the thought that we focus on, or the thought that we, I guess, put forward, can lead to a change in behavior. So in CBT, it mostly focuses on changing thoughts and changing behaviors. A lot of times changing behaviors by changing thoughts, like we start with a thought. It doesn't focus on changing feelings. It focuses on noticing the feelings and the ways that they lead to thoughts. So I just thought that might be a helpful model for people out there to think about, because a lot of times we and I want to come back to this with the reflection question at the end, but a lot of times we get thoughts and feelings mixed up. It's like um, especially I think that we use feelings language to describe thoughts or whatever, and it can help sometimes to distinguish between the two.
Yeah. I think this is important because I think there is a number of people out there, and there is definitely this message that kind of gets put out there that feelings are not helpful. And so it's best to just put your feelings down. They're irrational. They're never going to lead to anything good. So, why is this even important to care about your feelings? Or why is it even important to identify your feelings? And that's a part of it right there, is that whether you're always fully aware of what you're feeling or not, or whether what you allow your feelings to look like, regardless, like they do impact your behavior. And even if you don't have like incredibly destructive behaviors, or you're like, well, for the most part, like my behavior is good, so I don't really need to worry about it. But even sometimes neutral behaviors, if you are wanting, I think a lot of times what this comes down to is interpersonal relationships and how you are able to deal with others, and that is important. And I hope people can understand that being able to take an emotional temperature of a room, or consider other people's feelings within something as rational as business or whatever, like it is important to be able to understand the human element of that. And so having a better understanding and being able to identify those feelings and what thoughts that leads to in your behaviors can be important for making you a more well-rounded person, and just a more effective person in a number of ways.
Absolutely. Like I said, as somebody who defaults to being more analytical, I found it so helpful to take into account that just to basically take it for granted that emotions are there and they are affecting all of us all the time. It's kind of like uh, if I injure myself and if I'm trying to sort of block out the pain and ignore the pain as much as possible, and really even go to the extreme of pretending like the pain isn't there. It's like, okay, the pain is trying to tell me something. The pain is trying to tell me to stay off that ankle or to bandage up that cut or whatever it is, that I need to do this to protect myself. The pain is going to be there, whether I want to acknowledge it or focus on it or not. And it's the same with feelings. It's so much more helpful to take for granted that whether I'm accepting it, focusing on it, expressing it or not, the emotions are there. So just kind of accept that and try to incorporate that into your daily life and see how effective it is for you. So, and one other thing I wanted to acknowledge, because I think that some people fail to take this into account, is that we can feel multiple things at once, and that's okay. And so as you're just going back to that idea of the feelings wheel and identifying specific emotions, am I angry, or am I enraged, or am I in pain or scared, whatever it is, uh, it might be both, or it might be multiple. You might be feeling 4 or 5 different things, and it can help to take your time and actually identify that when you're able to. And a lot of times we're not able to right in that moment, but perhaps later that day, when things have calmed down, when you feel safer, then you can reflect on it.
Yeah, I think it can be important to point out too, it's not even multiple things within the same slice of that pie. Like it's like, oh, okay, I'm feeling multiple things in anger. You can be feeling angry and sad, or you can be feeling sad and happy, or it's not even like, okay, it's all from the same section. Like you can be on opposite sides of the wheels, because feelings are fun like that. So
My 5-year-old son is a lot like me in that he gets really into movies emotionally. And I remember being a kid and crying in almost every movie, especially towards the end. I tend to cry more when I'm happy than when I'm sad. And so we've talked about the emotion of sappy, where you're both sad and happy at the same time. And so I would say more often than not towards the end of a movie, unless he's super familiar with the movie and it's kind of lost its edge for him emotionally, but he'll be crying towards the end when, everything turns out all right. And um, I say, yeah, this is kind of a sappy ending, isn't it? And he's like, yeah. So, and then he'll come up and snuggle with us. So it's adorable, but it is good to be aware of these things. It's like, I am happy at this happy ending, or at this thing that I've been fighting for finally coming to fruition, or I can feel some relief. but also there's the sadness of all the pain that it took to get there, or, whatever your example is.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked a bit about identifying feelings, and now we want to get into the sort of category of accepting feelings. And to me, accepting, just because I've been in the grief world for so long, accepting does have a lot of baggage, because I actually try to avoid using the word accept when it comes to grief in particular, only because different words mean things to different people. And so accepting sometimes comes along with like, I have to approve of it. I have to be okay with it. I have to embrace it or be happy about it. And that may not be the case, certainly with grief, but also when it comes to your emotions, you don't necessarily have to be really happy about the feeling that you're feeling or the thing that happened that triggered your feeling. So just be aware of that as we talk about acceptance. I would say it really has to do with acknowledging it as real, right? With kind of
Yeah.
taking that reality and moving forward with it. That's all that it is.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be like you said, it's not a stamp of approval or like, I am so happy that I am sad right now, or that kind of thing.
Right.
But I think a lot of what this stems from is and this is something, I will struggle with sometimes too. But it's like, man, I am really upset right now and I just don't want to be, so I don't accept it, and then I don't have to feel it. But then it's like,
Yeah.
oh, it is still definitely there, and it doesn't matter that if I do not accept you, sadness is like, I don't care, I'm still here.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think there's been a lot of us who have grown up in households where we've touched on this a little bit in the identifying, but where certain emotions were allowed and other emotions were not so allowed, or some people who were told, you better not cry about that, or you better, like, there are certain emotions that were allowed. And I think we've touched on this a little bit too, but a lot of times, I think especially for men, but it's never falls into just that black and white of thinking, but anger is allowed and happiness is allowed. But sadness, like some of those emotions that are a little bit more vulnerable or show weakness, quote unquote, have been taught to you growing up are not acceptable. And so there's a lot of people who, like you've said, are a lot more comfortable reaching for anger because that was a emotion that was allowed, but then sadness wasn't allowed. Or honestly, there probably have been plenty of households too where you weren't allowed to feel angry about things. You just had to bottle up all of your emotions. And so this comes from kind of like an understanding of your emotions are there. And so it's acknowledging them as real and not trying to pretend that you can just wish them away. Or if you were just more strong, then you wouldn't have to feel these other emotions. So
Yeah. And for guys, a lot of times, even happiness, we need to, like, if we get a little bit too excited, too expressive, too happy, it's like, hey, calm down there, buddy, or and anger, I've also noticed, again, painting with broad brushes here, but historically, I think for women, a lot of times, if a woman is angry, then that's taken differently than a man being angry, and it's generally less socially acceptable. So I did have a few things I wanted to talk about with this real quick. Just that I believe pretty strongly that we as humans are actually more emotional than we are logical. Even those of us who are more comfortable with a logical, rational thought, I believe that most of us, I would say well over 90% of us probably, are actually more driven by emotions, whether we're aware of it or not. And going along with what Kelsey was saying, as human beings, we're social creatures. We're evolved to live in groups and interact with one another and support one another. And so our brains are designed to influence one another, especially when it comes to emotions. And a lot of this is invisible. A lot of it is unseen. We have just been discovered in the last 30 years or so that we have these mirror neurons, so that when we're around people, for instance, if you are watching somebody eat delicious food, it causes you to salivate, or it causes you to imagine what it must be like to be eating that thing. It's a very easy example. Or, we watch somebody else and they get badly injured, and we actually can feel physical pain sometimes from that. So these are really valuable things, but it's interesting how it comes into effect with emotions and what is acceptable and what's not, because my emotions could cause you discomfort. And so as a result, especially if I'm a child and you're my parent and you care about me and you don't want to see me hurting in this way, or you don't want me to be somebody who um, is an angry person because that makes you uncomfortable with your own anger, right? There's all these complex, specific dynamics that can happen. You might tell me to sort of tamp that down. And without even realizing it, you're doing that to protect yourself. And it's really a self-centered thing to do. Again, I come across this so often with grief. It's like, here's a box of tissues, please don't cry. The person who died would not want you to be crying right now, these kinds of toxic messages. But really, we wouldn't be saying that if we were completely comfortable with them crying. And this holds true for so many emotions. So I think that's what's behind the emotions that are more socially acceptable. It's like, how does it make people around us feel for me to be feeling this?
Yeah, it's always so interesting to me how many people, it's their automatic reaction when they start crying to say, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Like all the
absolutely.
time you see people, I mean, I watch Dateline a lot. I think I've already said this, but like the number of people who they'll get emotional while they're talking about their loved one who had been murdered and they start crying. They say, I'm sorry, I just need a minute, I'm sorry. And it's like, it's such an automatic reaction to so many people because there's some belief in there that my sadness is affecting somebody else negatively, so I need to apologize for this. And that's just interesting. But yeah.
Yeah, I found it helpful to respond to that because I do encounter that pretty often by saying to the person who's apologizing, you need to cry. This is
Mhm.
what you need right now. And you might even say that to yourself if you catch yourself apologizing for getting emotional in any way. It's like, no, this is what I need. What
Yeah.
is this trying to tell me?
Yeah.
Right. If you were not crying right now, I'd probably be more concerned, much more concerned than that you are crying because you're talking about this horrific thing. So,
Yeah.
and another interesting one along those lines is a lot of times I notice people start laughing when they are talking about something that's very uncomfortable for them.
Yep.
And so it's funny to reflect on that. And that's a learned behavior because again, if, if I can laugh, if I can smile, that makes the people around me feel better than showing how I actually feel about the super uncomfortable, scary thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, and one other thing I wanted to share is uh, going back to about reflecting on your feelings. It's just that the reality is that there are moments in our lives where it is best for our safety and the safety of those around us sometimes to put our emotional responses kind of on the back burner. There are times where that's necessary. I think that some of us overdo that. We convince ourselves that we need to keep pushing it off simply because it's uncomfortable for us. But there are times for that. If there is a physical threat, if there is a highly distressing situation, actual danger, then naturally that's not the best time to sort of fall apart, right? We need to get safe. We need to take care of business. But then afterward, those feelings are still going to be carried around inside of us. So we need to express it later on.
I think, what first things first. If somebody in our audience is listening to this and they're saying, man, I've always had a really hard time accepting my emotions, whether it was because they grew up in a household that wasn't allowed, or I mean, it doesn't even have to be a household. Like there's some societal pieces to that too of
Totally.
that. So if somebody is realizing that they're like, man, I've never been good at accepting my emotions, what would be kind of like the first step that you would give them? Like for, some of your clients that you've had that are new to this concept a little bit, or new to the concept of allowing their emotions, what would be like the first step you would take or advise them to take?
Yeah, that's a great question. A few things. One, if somebody is really, really actually disconnected from their feelings, sometimes I'll do this. This is an exercise within the realm of EMDR, um, but it can probably be modified outside of that as well to associate an emotion with an image. So, what does that look like to you? What image comes to mind for you that represents that? And just kind of closing your eyes. And when you say the word uh, shame, right, what's the image that comes to mind? that can be kind of an interesting place to start if you feel completely disconnected from your emotions. Now, if it's like, no, I know what the feelings are, I just don't like to think about them, I don't know how to express them. I really like mindfulness exercises and the effects that those can have for us, being aware of our bodies, our senses, but also our thoughts and our feelings. If we can slow down and be quiet and turn inward and take our time and practice non-judgment, uh, most of us can actually pay attention to what's there. And so practicing that on a daily basis, if possible, even for 5 minutes, I mean, ideally maybe 10 to 20 minutes, but even 5 minutes every day or something, that is, it's like a muscle, right? You get better at it with practice. So that's a good place to start as well when it comes to being aware of the feelings that are there. And then I would just say, going along with that, practicing expressing your feelings. So if you're somebody who's not comfortable, for instance, crying around other people, that's fine. You don't have to cry around other people. Maybe eventually you'll get comfortable doing that, but if you don't, that's fine too, as long as you get the feeling out. And so maybe just in your room alone or in the shower or wherever you feel comfortable with that, just try letting it out. And it might be uncomfortable and awkward and even embarrassing at first. Even if no one else is around, you might feel embarrassed. But taking some of those first steps and practicing them, and you eventually will get more comfortable with them. One other idea is to write about it. I know we've talked about journaling and writing on this podcast before because it's so beneficial, but keeping a feelings journal. And it's like, I like to start with, what am I feeling right now in the present? So right now I am feeling, and then you just go, right? And it might be one more word, or it might be a few more sentences about how you're feeling, or perhaps even more. Or you could say, today, you can think back through your day at the end of the day and identify the most important events that happened. And then how do you feel about those things? Right. So writing it out is another good way to practice identifying.
Yeah. I think even maybe an additional thing for somebody, especially who's having a difficult time accepting that emotion, is right now I am feeling blank, fill in that blank, and then at the end of it, and that is okay. Could be a helpful thing too.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I love that. And another saying that I share with clients that I certainly use a lot in my own life is, there's no such thing as a bad feeling.
Yeah.
And to me, here's my heart on my sleeve. I get emotional almost every time that I say that, because that's just so powerful. There's no such thing as a bad feeling. How freeing is that? And some people out there might question the truth of that. I would encourage you to just experiment and try operating as if that's true and see what it does for you. There's no such thing as a bad feeling, because who is a feeling actually hurting, right? If my feelings are making someone else uncomfortable, it's like, well, sorry, but but I feel this way, like, again, using grief as an easy example, it's like, if my sadness over the death of my loved one makes you uncomfortable, like, really, that's the other person's problem, right? They need to regulate their own feelings. They need to get comfortable with their own feelings. They need to excuse themselves, perhaps, if they really can't tolerate it. But that is not your responsibility to censor your emotions to make the people around you comfortable. Now, there are times where we can express feelings in ways that are destructive, and that's something to be aware of and maybe channel that in a different direction. But outside of that, remember that there's no such thing as a bad feeling. There are, and even there's no such thing as a bad thought, right? All kinds of strange thoughts enter our heads, let's be honest. And only actions can really be bad. Only actions can really harm other people. So no such thing as a bad thought, and certainly no such thing as a bad feeling.
One kind of final thought I have for this section is, I think you kind of just touched on why this is such an important thing for people to get in better touch with their emotions, because a lot of times the people who are struggling with identifying and accepting their emotions are the people in that scenario who are uncomfortable with somebody else's emotions. And a lot of
Very true.
times, you don't want to be that person. You don't want to be that person that is unsafe to be around because you're so uncomfortable with emotion that you can't handle being around people who have emotion, because that's just part of the human experience. And so that to me is why this is such an important thing for people to get in touch with their emotions, because a lot of times it's the people who are uncomfortable that make it more difficult on people with their emotions. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and if I could chime in with one more thing as well, I wanted to really hit on, and I know that hopefully we get to this in the next Dealing with Feelings episode that is geared more towards people who seem to be really overwhelmed by their emotions and consumed by their emotions, and because that can present a whole other set of problems compared to those who are out of touch with them. But going back to meditation, meditation can be really helpful also for helping us see ourselves as separate from our feelings. Uh, we can notice our feelings and notice what's going on in our brains and not become overwhelmed by them. We can let them pass, let them go, and realize that I, the one who's observing those feelings, still exist separately from those. So, one more. Um, what's the word? I guess one more word in support of meditation when it comes to dealing with feelings.
Yeah. Do you have like a specific place that you send your clients for those meditations or mindfulness, or is it just like a practice that you have
We
people do
usually
on their
practice
own?
it in session. I
Okay.
usually teach them. And I will say, though, that the mindfulness meditation that I put out for Embrace Mental Health does focus on um, getting into that place of noticing our thoughts, and our feelings are certainly a part of that. But I do take time in that exercise to encourage people to be aware of your thoughts and let them go, and understand that the thoughts, including the feelings, those clouds that cover up the blue sky of our mind, they're going to continue coming. Our mind continues to go different places, and that's fine. That's just what it's supposed to do. But also, we don't have to kind of continue spiraling down the rabbit hole of whatever that thought or feeling is. We can notice it and be okay about it, be neutral about it, and let it go. And just practicing that. Like, if you practice that for quite a while on a regular basis, you will find that you're more clear-headed and your mind doesn't wander all over the place like bouncing around like a pinball quite as much as it used to. So you do, quote unquote, get better at that. But that's really not the point. The point is to actually just practice it, that practice of noticing what's on your mind and letting it go. The more that you can do that, the more benefits you're going to find.
Yeah.
So check it out. The mindfulness one. There are, I think where I wanted to go with this, and I really wanted to speak to those of us who are more analytical by default. We live in a post-Enlightenment society. Enlightenment being like I think it's like the 1600s, that period in the Western world of the Enlightenment, with all kinds of art, and where really the concept of rational thought was quantified and expressed and embraced by most Western societies, right? And that is the society that our own has been birthed out of. And so often in our world, at least here in the United States, what I've experienced is that like rational thought and the scientific method, these things that came out of that Enlightenment period, these things are sort of the be all end all. They are really sort of like a god in our society. And a lot of great things have come out of that and continue to come out of that, thinking rationally, testing hypotheses, that sort of way of thinking. But just this concept that has been so helpful for me, that there are other ways of knowing things than rationally. And so um, our thoughts and our feelings sometimes can come into conflict. Sometimes we know something in our mind, but we are feeling and experiencing something very different. And so often we feel like the right thing to do is to go for what's rational. And in some situations that's true, but in some it's not. Sometimes what we are feeling and experiencing is actually more valuable than the sort of right answer that we know to be true in our heads. Sometimes we can just kind of get a bad vibe about a situation. And you know what that actually is, at least from a neuroscience perspective, is that our brains are extremely powerful and can take all kinds of shortcuts that we're not even aware of to just know stuff. We just get there. We just know it. We don't have to understand why we know it, but we just know it. And that can be a feeling in your gut. That can be a tension. That can be the skip of a heart, whatever it is. But all that to say, I try to encourage people to pay attention to their intuition, to sort of listen to their inner voice. Again, going back to mindfulness and meditation can be extremely helpful for practicing that. But so often paying attention to other ways of knowing things, thinking and understanding that are not just in the realm of just rational scientific thought can be really helpful for those of us who do that as a default. Consider it a challenge or like a whole new way of being, a whole new way of thinking that might really benefit you as a person.
So the last step that we had shared originally that we kind of wanted to go through a little bit more thoroughly for our friends who might have a little bit harder time being in touch with their emotions, and that is the express. There are, now for people a little bit more like me who are more feelings oriented, like I generally don't have too much trouble expressing my feelings, but I know that can be a difficult thing for a lot of people. So yeah, we just wanted to break down a little bit of what expressing your feelings could look like, or different ways that you can practice that, but also why that is an important step to take. So
Yeah. And I think a couple of easy reasons is that expressing feelings is kind of our mind and body's natural release valve. When we come across things in our day-to-day lives, they do make us feel certain ways. And those feelings can be overwhelming. It can be like a hurricane inside of us, and it can really stress us out until we express it, until we let it out in some way. And then we feel better. The easiest example is after you have a good cry, you feel a lot better afterwards. And there are stress hormones in our tears, especially when it comes to tears of sadness. And so after we cry, we feel better because that stress has chemically left our body. and that's just one example of how our bodies are really designed to express feelings freely. And then another major benefit to expressing our feelings is it can be a lot easier to identify our feelings when we actually get them out. It's like, oh, that was there. That thing just sort of came out. I let it out. And now I know that I was sad, or I was angry, or I was overjoyed. I was relieved, right? So it can help with that process.
yeah. I think generally, if we don't allow ourselves to express feelings, they usually are either going to explode at a certain point because they'll just keep building up and eventually it explodes, or they start to erode. So they start to erode in yourself, and that can express itself in a lot of different ways. But simply refusing to express an emotion doesn't make it just go away or not have any effect anymore. I think too, kind of like an important distinction to make is I think a lot of times when people think of like, oh, expressing my emotion, they think of it has to be such an outward expression. Like,
Mhm.
okay, if I have to express my anger, then it has to be this like loud yelling or whatever, or like sadness, like expressing emotions mean I need to be wailing in the shower or whatever.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of more subtle or even kind of inward ways of expressing emotions that don't have to be so demonstrative. Because I mean, there are certainly going to be people who are just never going to be comfortable in that sort of outward expression of emotion. And that's okay. There's more than one way to express any emotion. And so keeping that in mind, that if you're not comfortable or that's just not your style, like there are still healthy and good ways that you can express your emotion. It doesn't have to look like this massive production of expression too.
What would be one or two examples, Kelsey, that come to mind for you when it comes to more inward or less expressive ways of expressing, less smaller ways or whatever, in more
I
comfortable
think
ways?
I think writing can be
Mm.
a good way to express an emotion or to kind of get it out. That doesn't mean you have to. I mean, when I journal, I definitely cry, but I am much like Wes. Like it does not take much for me to cry. So,
Mm.
but like there are certain times where, yeah, just kind of writing something out, or even listening to sad music, or it doesn't even have to be music with lyrics. You can listen to a classical music song that is written in a minor key. That can be a helpful way of kind of expressing an inner feeling. And
Mhm.
I guess that would be one of the ways that I would think of.
Okay, yeah. And uh, another way, and I don't know that I would consider this inward, but it's kind of an alternative way a lot of people don't think about, is anything creative.
Yeah.
I would encourage everybody out there to have some kind of a creative outlet, whether it is music or painting or sculpting or building stuff. Again, going back to a
Yeah.
lot of traditional male roles, it's like if you are feeling really sad or really lonely, you can make something. You can fix something, right? By making something that wasn't there before, that can be really an emotional outlet. So I guess in addition to those alternative or creative ways of expressing feelings, or I love that about listening to music, being around other people who are being creative or who are talking about feelings. This is the power of support groups in a lot of situations, is it's like identifying, again, those mirror neurons, identifying with other people who are expressing things that you yourself feel can be super powerful. Um, but I do want to give a lot of credit to talking about feelings, right? That's one of the more traditional ways of thinking about it. But boy, can it be helpful and powerful, because a lot of it has to do with our brains and how feelings so often exist in parts of our brains as these sort of experiential, vague forces. And it can feel overwhelming or mysterious or scary. And when we put language to it, and writing can be one of the most effective ways of doing this, but talking it out can be helpful too. When we can put words to it or point to something on the feelings wheel, that brings it into a part of our brain that we're identifying it as a thing that exists separate from ourselves and in some ways outside of ourselves. We can start to get some healthy distance from that feeling and learn from it more effectively. So that process in itself, being able to put things into words and saying, I am feeling this way, or taking it a step further. And it's like, I feel this. And so here's what I'm going to do about it, right? These kinds of things, actually defining it and putting it into language. It sounds so basic, but it's really powerful, and it's doing all kinds of helpful things in our brains.
Yeah.
Well, I would say a couple of things for people who are just so like, even after hearing us talk about all this stuff, or I don't know, being exposed to other things that really normalize emotional expression, just not convinced, not persuaded, or just saying, I just cannot do that. I will never be able to do that. Um, First of all, not with that attitude, but also I think that maybe what we're really missing is you're not convinced of the benefit. Like, it's just not an attractive enough thing for you to consider trying, because it is so scary or so foreign to you. And so I would encourage you to consider what I said earlier about how we are emotional. This is what science shows. This is what our social interactions show. Perhaps you have a hard time identifying it in yourself, but think about the people who you know who are maybe they they try to be really strong. They're very uncomfortable with feelings. I think that most of us can identify someone like that in our life, and how so often people who are the most uncomfortable with emotions are the most ruled by their feelings, and they can just kind of have an outburst at the drop of a hat, or some small little thing happens and they really overreact to it. What that actually is they're not even upset about that thing that just happened. They're upset about a whole bunch of stuff that they've got shoved down. And so it comes out with extra strength. Think about relationships, between a romantic relationship between two people, and the little things that people get upset over. It's like, I'm not really upset because you peeled the orange the wrong way. It's not about the orange. It's that, I feel like you never listen to me, or you never, um, you don't take me seriously, whatever it is. It's about all this stuff that it's like there's thing after thing after thing that I've been pushing down. So that is one thing to consider. And another thing to consider, again, I feel like hopefully people aren't getting tired of me referring to grief, but I just feel like it has so many things to teach us. Um, when it comes to working through grief, so many of us feel like we need to be strong, right? That's the thing. I've got to be strong for so and so, for the person who died, or for my other family members, or whatever. And a lot of it has to do, it can be helpful to reconsider our definition of strength, right? Is strength always emotionlessness? What makes emotionlessness strong? Right? That's a socially contrived concept that does not portray strength. To me, being a strong person means doing the right thing even when it's hard, right? It means doing the thing sometimes that we least want to do when we know that it's going to be good for us, when we know it's going to be good for the people around us. And so by that definition, which I think is a very plausible definition, um, then sometimes crying, sometimes falling apart, sometimes being honest about our feelings is the strongest possible thing that we could do, because it's the most scary. It's the thing that's the least comfortable for us. But if you can find a way to do it anyway, that is really a whole new level of strength. And so I'm not trying to trick you or convince you into, I'm not trying to like move words around necessarily to get you to be this emotional basket case. Far from it, actually, because by identifying and expressing your emotions in a healthy way, like we're talking about, the ironic thing is you are going to find yourself being less ruled by your emotions. You're going to be more in control of how you're expressing your feelings, because you're actually noticing that they're there, and you're calling it what it is, right? You're acting on the way things really are.
Yeah. I think a lot of times when that idea of, okay, I have to be strong, or I can't allow myself to feel that emotion, or I just have to be stoic and hold this front or whatever, I think a lot of times that's just masking a lot of fear. A fear of like, I don't actually know how to deal with this emotion. So if I allow it to kind of take any surface in my life, it's going to take over, and then I'm going to lose all control.
Mhm.
And what we're trying to say, and what we're trying to argue here, is that actually a lot more that you learn how to express and identify and work with your emotions, the stronger you get, and the less control that those emotions are going to have of overtaking you.
Yeah.
And there can be a lot of fear in that, and that's real, like that. But that's, maybe that's where you start. You start realizing, okay, why do I have this fear around this?
Mhm. Yeah. Going back to that cognitive behavioral, feelings lead to thoughts, lead to behaviors. If we can actually be aware of that process, we do not have to act out of our emotions. I can be afraid of something and do it anyway. Something can make me sad, and yet I can sit with it and
Hmm.
just be sad, and I don't have to necessarily fall apart. I can have tears streaming down my face and continue living my life, right?
Hmm.
But only by letting those feelings out and identifying them, letting them be what they are. So I think that that's one more fear I wanted to speak to, and it goes along with what you're saying, Kelsey. I think that um, we don't have to assume that your emotions are more likely to control your behavior when you try to ignore them
Hmm.
than if you can identify them, accept them, and express them in a healthy way. Then you are the one in the driver's seat who gets to choose what your behaviors are going to be, whether you want your emotions to inform those choices or whether you want to act in spite of your emotions.
Um, I think another kind of thing to consider too is like, okay, if you follow kind of your, not your Wesley, but like somebody who's like, well, I don't know about this whole emotions thing. Like
Mhm.
if you follow your belief down to the bottom line a little bit, so potentially are thinking like, life would just be better without emotion. But when you
Mhm.
really think about like, what would a world, or what would a society look like if emotion had no place in it, or like what does emotion add to life? And we've talked some about how emotions are signals for us, like how in Inside Out, the sadness emotion was a signal to the people around her, that Riley, the kid,
Mhm.
that she needed some extra support in that time. And a lot of times that is what our emotions are, is they're indicators of our needs, which is, that's a good thing. We need those indicators to understand what our needs are. But I think too, just, thinking about what is the benefit of emotion I think so much of the beauty of the world, of life, stems from emotions. And I mean, obviously, we've talked about music and art and some of that, like that beauty. But I think even just the richness of relationship comes from emotion. And that's one thing that, like, if you shut yourself off to emotion, you shut yourself off from that aspect of relationship. And that's, such a rich and beautiful part of relationship with one another. And I don't even mean just romantic relationship. I mean friendship and
Hmm.
just any kind of
Yeah,
friendship,
family.
relationship,
Hmm.
family. Yep, of like that shared understanding of emotion is where a lot of beauty and richness comes from in relationship too. And so you really don't want
Yeah,
to shut yourself off to all emotion, because you actually shut yourself off to a lot of the best parts of life. So
that's so well said. I'm so glad you mentioned that, Kelsey. And this is something that I've talked before about how I see a lot of things through the lens of trauma, and a lot of times people who have been traumatized do this, and most of us have experienced trauma on some level or another. And I would define that simply as things, overwhelming experiences from the past that continue to affect us negatively in the present. Right. So if you take that definition, is that we, because we feel like we will be overwhelmed if we open up to the feelings associated with the thing that happened, or even taking trauma out of the picture, just say uncomfortable feelings, right? Then the only option is to shut down all of our feelings, or to turn the volume way down on all of our feelings. We cannot mentally, cognitively, only shut down the uncomfortable feelings. It's really all or nothing. And so
yeah,
if you try to do that, you'll probably, maybe you'll express the happiness on the outside, but that fear, that loneliness, that sadness, whatever it is for you, that anger, um, those are going to continue to be there, and at some point come out probably in an unhealthy way. So yeah, by turning the volume down to 1 on our feelings, we're really just kind of living life on the surface of the water, right? When uh, if we can open up to all these feelings, the good, the bad, the pleasant, the uncomfortable, then that allows us to experience more depth and richness in life and have a more meaningful life.
hmm
And it can be scary, it can be risky, but like so many things, it can be worth it too.
yeah. All right,
All
Wes,
right.
would you like to share our closing reflection, homework,
Yes,
question, etc.?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, so here is, it's not so much a question for you to consider, and I feel like that's maybe less than half the time we actually do a question, but this is something for you to reflect on and to practice, okay? Uh, Going back to something I said earlier, our language often muddles up our ability to identify our feelings accurately. I think that something that I see, and maybe it's just because I'm a therapist, but it is sort of a pet peeve for me when people say, "I feel like this thing," and then they actually just say what they're thinking, right? I feel like that's I feel like that doesn't make any sense. It's like, what emotion is that? It doesn't make it like, so either say I'm confused, I feel like, I'm confused, or I don't think that makes any sense, right? So I'm not trying to just, again, be a language police, but there's a quote, I want to say it's by Heschel, that words create worlds. The language that we use forms our concept of reality. So it really is powerful. So practice being aware of those kinds of statements and try to be accurate. And it could be a little thing that people around you probably won't even notice. Or if they do notice, you can explain it to them and get them to try it too. But when you're expressing a thought, try saying, I think. When you're expressing a feeling, try to say, I feel. When you say, I feel, um, and then you go to a thought, try to be like, okay, but actually what I'm feeling is this. And you can go to that wheel image if you want to, or just your knowledge of different emotions that exist. But yeah, so just try to practice being accurate with your language of what you think and what you feel. And then when you talk about your feelings, try to be as specific as you can. This is another exercise that can be helpful. And so there are many emotions out there. Some of them are very similar, but not quite right. Sometimes there's the masking emotion, and then there's the feeling behind the feeling. So just try putting some of these things into practice in your daily life. Maybe you just want to start with the accurate, I think, versus I feel. But anyway, just some things to consider, something practical to take with you.
Yeah. Interesting. I like that. I'm curious. I'm going to do that myself and probably catch myself a few times and be like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, everybody. And I'm going to do my best at sharing the socials right now. So we are on Facebook at facebook.com/emh.nsc, or if you just look up Embrace Mental Health and see our logo, that's probably the easiest way to find us. We are also on Instagram at embrace.mental.health. And you can also email us at embracementalhealthnsc@gmail.com. And we're also on YouTube. I mean, some of you are watching us on YouTube right now, so you're aware of that, but you can find us on YouTube. And that's also a good place to like and subscribe or leave us some comments. But regardless of which way it is that you want to kind of be connected with us, to kind of see what we're posting, but also to send us questions or comments or suggestions or any kind of thing. Again, we definitely want this to have like a community feel to it. So yeah.
Yeah, especially with this podcast, because we're going to be doing more dealing with feelings episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we came close to talking about something but didn't quite get there, you really want to hear our thoughts on it, then say, hey, next time, can you explore this other thing and give us a suggestion?
Yes, we love suggestions. So yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yep. Have a great week. Bye.